Hi, I'm Brian DeForest, NASCA's Research Vice Chair, coming to you from Salem, the capital of the great state of Oregon. Today, we are digging deep into the subject of supply chain and stockpile management with Curt Topper from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Hello and welcome back to NASCA TV. I'm Scott Wayne in the NASCA Virginia studios, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Curt Topper in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Curt, hello and welcome.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Curt, give us a little bit of background. Give us just 2 minutes on your career journey. How did you land up in Harrisburg serving the citizens of Pennsylvania?
Well, Scott, I've spent most of my career doing supply chain and operations in the public and in the private sector. I came into this role, I think, because I served as a deputy secretary in the department during Governor Rendell's administration in Pennsylvania, and left for a few years. And then when Governor Wolf was elected, he offered me the opportunity to come back as the agency head. And it's been a great adventure for the last 6 years. There are really very few things I'm more passionate about professionally than helping government perform better. It's a big part of what I care about.
So some of us have rugby, some of us have baseball. You have making government run more effectively.
Yeah, oddly enough, it's sort of like a hobby. I have hobbies too, but you know, I do enjoy this work.
But you've worked in supply chain pretty much your whole career. Is that correct?
Yeah, I started with a company called Free Markets after leaving graduate school at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And Free Markets was sort of a .com business during the time when .com businesses really sort of blew up, the whole B2B market. And we started we invented the technology for reverse auctions for the purpose of awarding supply chain or supply contracts. And so I worked with the Global 1000 in that capacity for a number of years. And ever since have been focused on things like supply chain and contracting.
You are very unpopular with lots of vendors around the world.
Yeah, I tell my team all the time that if we're doing procurement and contracting the right way, we're almost inevitably going to make more people unhappy than we make happy. It's sort of an occupational hazard.
So let's talk about making people unhappy. As we record this, the ship has just maneuvered itself out of the way of the Suez Canal. I always love talking about outliers. I particularly love talking to MBA students about, you think you can predict the future, just wait for a few days and see for the surprise to land. What did you think when you saw that enormous ship find itself trapped in the Suez Canal?
Well, like everybody, right? I've been fascinated by the photographs.
Right.
Just the extraordinary scale. I don't think anybody, what's interesting about that whole industry is that you're not supposed to see it.
Yeah.
Right? It operates behind the scenes all the time, and just to see the sheer scale of the ship in comparison with the massive earth-moving equipment that they brought in, and to see that it wasn't all that massive at all in comparison, I thought that was fascinating. And also just to see how dependent we are, and the implications. I read somewhere that it was millions of dollars an hour, right, or hundreds of millions of dollars an hour based on that delay in the Suez Canal. So really underscored for me just how dependent we are on our supply chains and how much we take for granted.
Yeah. I mean, I joked earlier about your hobby around making government more effective and supply chains. The headlines out of Europe for the past week have either been the Suez Canal and the implications that it would have on Europe first, and then the East Coast of the United States in terms of shipping. And then, of course, the vaccine arguments and debates over limits on supply chains and whether you impede. And the EU currently has backed away from that. but under the principle of free flow of supply chains. Like literally that language has now entered the public vernacular in a way that a year and a half ago, if you'd said to a man or woman on the street, you know, what do you think about global supply chains? I don't think we'd have got a response, but today we hear PPE and everything that's related to it.
Yeah, I think it's really going to force us to rethink what we mean by capacity in a lot of key areas that we're responsible for as government leaders. You know, I think about pre-pandemic. You know, no one ever imagined that you would show up at a hospital in the United States and have to wait for a ventilator. Like that was an unimaginable outcome just a little over a year ago, and it's one that we've now all had to confront. And I think we've seen firsthand now probably the limits of strategies that we employed over the last 2 decades in order to try to pull waste and cost out of our operations. I think we've seen some of the limits of that.
So,
you know,
so let's frame this for a second, because there's a chance that your peers and counterparts across the states are sort of listening to this as they prepare breakfast or work out on their bike or whatever they happen to be doing as they're listening to this. Let's get to the fundamentals of reframing supply chain procurement, supply security. To your point, 18 months ago, all of the cool things to be doing would be keeping just-in-time inventory, making sure that assets were not sitting on the balance sheets of states, that we were minimizing warehouse space, outsourcing as much as possible. How's that changed today in terms of how language is used and what's seen as success with regard to procurement and supply chain?
well, you know, Scott, I think it's still changing. I don't think we know yet. I think it's gonna evolve here in Pennsylvania. It'll evolve certainly through the remainder of the current legislative session as we work through a budget proposal that includes new expenses for maintaining a PPE store that we never had to maintain before. And so the debate about that is still ongoing. The whole experience, though, has really made me really think about you know, a career in doing this kind of business in the public sector. You know, roughly 15 years ago, I was involved in an effort to close about 17 half-empty warehouses in Harrisburg and in the surrounding area of Harrisburg, because we had come into a world where every agency was running its own warehouse, and we were storing things like office supplies and you know, photocopiers and all kinds of equipment and things, office furniture, things we didn't really need to store, many things that we could have delivered next day very reliably. And so we based on that insight that we could have all these things delivered next day by our partners in the private sector, we set about closing all of those warehouses with the exception of 1 or 2 and consolidating all of that expense into a single organization within the Commonwealth. At the time, we crowed about how much money we were saving. We were saving literally millions of dollars. And we were really proud of the fact that we were operating in a way that was a lot more like the private sector. You know, getting all of those assets off the balance sheet, you know, really moving to more of a just-in-time model. And it worked great. And it still does for many of those commodity areas that we consolidated. But I think this year has really forced us to rethink some key things that we might have taken for granted, specifically around public things we need for public health.
So this is fascinating. I imagine if you're speaking to one of your colleagues in the legislature, it's easy today to say, hey, we need to build in a budget for having reserves of PPE because we've just gone through that experience. And of course, we tend to prepare for the last war that we fought. And it strikes me that the next crisis is unlikely to be a pandemic. Not that we won't have future pandemics, but the next one is unlikely to be a pandemic. How do you make the case? How do you analogize PPE and say, actually, there's this whole category of what my team define as critical risk assets that we need to keep in reserve. It might be communications equipment, should there be a cyber attack that takes out a section of the United States. Or I think about the blackouts and the brownouts that the Northeast experienced a decade or so ago. How do you sort of take this lesson and genericize it and persuade those that are setting your budget that actually this is more than just PPE, this is about a mindset around reserves?
Well, that's a great question, Scott. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that we're equipped to look that far ahead, if I'm being honest. I think that we have a model, and it's not unlike many states in that my agency serves every other agency in the Commonwealth. So the Department of Health has an agenda for what it needs and what it needs to plan for. The Department of Transportation, same. Our Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency certainly is starting to rethink the kinds of things that they feel like they need in reserve. But we're reminded every day that prior to the pandemic, what we were really focused on from an emergency response perspective was things like floods in Pennsylvania, right? It was bad storms. Yeah. It was the occasional hurricane that managed to make it all the way, across New Jersey and into eastern Pennsylvania. And these are all short duration, difficult to be sure, right? But they're all very short duration kinds of emergencies. And this is the first time that we've ever had to have an emergency declaration and then extend it and extend it again and extend it again and extend it again. And it's the first time we've ever had to be on an emergency footing for this kind of duration. So I think the whole experience, I think we're still trying to figure out what the lessons are from it, from the perspective of what we do planning forward. Oddly enough, it's not that easy convincing the General Assembly that we need to spend incrementally another $5 million a year on a warehouse and PPE equipment, because folks don't believe that we're going to have another pandemic next year or the year after or the year after. And so we're getting some very, I think, reasonable questions about, well, how much do you need to have on hand? How long do you need to have it on hand? We think often about the H1N1 experience in Pennsylvania, which frankly led to a lot of stranded inventory after the event. And that inventory expired, so that by the time we went to try to recover it and use it this year, we found that it was unusable. So part of what we've had to do is think about putting a business plan together that rotates the stock. We have sufficient volume from public agencies in Pennsylvania that we ought to be able to maintain about a 2-month worth of reserve and rotate it at a sufficient rate so that it never expires. So our ongoing cost is really not so much inventory and maintaining inventory as it is the facility and the staff to manage it.
Yeah, and it sounds like the shifting expertise from a team that might have been dedicated to transactional procurement to a team that's about life cycle inventory management, risk mitigation, as much as whether we got an extra cent off the cost of the widget, so to speak. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, we have a warehousing team already. We have a Bureau of Supplies and Surplus Operations that manages, state surplus, and also still manages a pretty significant warehousing operation to support the Commonwealth agencies. So we have the expertise to do it. One of the things that I think we've learned throughout the pandemic is that the model that we have, where DGS is sort of on the receiving end, where we're told what to buy and how long to keep it, and that sort of thing, it isn't a model that necessarily works. We we're now discussing with our agency customers about how to bring to bear concepts from supply chain to these decisions about what we buy and how much. So all the modeling that's been done around, can we rotate the stock? Can we do this in a manner that's efficient? And bringing a business case to our General Assembly, that's been something that my team has really taken on and done a great job with. And it's a set of skills that doesn't necessarily reside on its own in PIMA or in health. So it's been a collaborative effort, to be sure, but I think it's forcing us to rethink sort of, am I at the end of this decision-making chain, or am I at the beginning of this decision-making chain? And we're discovering that we're a lot more comfortable if we're at the beginning of it.
Well, and that may be one of the big takeaways for your colleagues and counterparts across the states, which is get onto the front foot and off the back foot as much as you can to shape the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Okay. So let's just go back a year. You probably don't want to go back a year in your memory. You've probably compartmentalized it or blanked it out. Give us some insights into what did your world look like in April of 2020? You're working from home, but you're in this environment where numbers are spiking rapidly. We don't have a full picture of the nature of this virus. What did life look like for you and for your team?
Well, it was chaotic, as I'm sure it was for everyone. We had to, just like everyone else, we had to figure out how to telework virtually overnight. Right around this time last year was when we went full on telework, at least. But when I say full on telework, that's really only about 30% of my agency. 70% of our agency continued to show up on site and continued to perform their duties on site. That included the folks who had to stand up a 500,000 foot temporary warehouse space in our farm show complex in order to store, in order to build the RSS and to store the inbound inventory that we were anticipating from the federal government, as well as all the inbound inventory that we were trying to figure out how to purchase. It was absolutely chaotic as we all figured out how to use this technology, and a lot of time on the phone. A lot of new skills had to be learned by our procurement and our supply chain team. It was one thing to suspend the normal rules of sort of how we interact with the marketplace, but it was fascinating to me to see how among the procurement staff there were those who were like, "Thank God the cuffs are off. Let's go," right? The folks who were really happy about being able to do this work on an emergency footing, and they're able to interact, directly with the marketplace, and we could say to them, "We need hand sanitizer. Go get it." And then there was this other half of the staff that I think really relied on the routines and the structure and the approach that the Commonwealth historically has taken to procurement, which involves a fairly elongated process where we have solicitations and responses, and we do bid tabs and we make decisions and we move on, right? And so that was fascinating, managing how everybody kind of reacted to the new reality, because the new reality was you have to go get it, you have to go get it fast. Because we discovered very quickly that we couldn't count, we had no ability to predict what was going to show up in the RSS from the feds. And we had that, and everybody's experienced this, right? We also, learned fairly early on that from our primary suppliers of things like N95 masks, we learned from them very quickly that the feds had effectively, commandeered all of their capacity and inventory, which left us, just like the rest of our fellow state leaders, in sort of a mad dash to figure out how we could, outside of our traditional supply chains and outside of our our current contracts at the time, we had to figure out how to go to China direct, and lock up manufacturing capacity with Chinese manufacturers working with brokers in order to get the materials here as quickly as we could get them. And in that sense, it was rough because we were competing with every other state. And we were handling inbound offers to help from every broker imaginable who had some kind of contact in China or Malaysia or wherever these goods are manufactured, regardless of whether they were in the lumber business before, they were in the mask business today. And and so it was a lot of inbound traffic, a lot to sort through. Everyone who called was a friend of the governor, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Turns out none of them were really friends of the governor, but you know how it is. And so we had to navigate all of that, and it was chaos for at least 2 or 3 months. And I just I couldn't be prouder of the team who worked. They worked 24/7 for 3-4 months. Both the team that was focused on procurement and trying to locate supplies and bring supplies in, and the team that was receiving these massive amounts of inventory, breaking them down, repackaging them, and then getting that inventory out the door to nursing homes and local municipalities and school districts, and every local entity that was coming to us looking for these materials. The team just did an extraordinary job of weathering the stress of whatever their own family situation was, and whatever anxiety they were carrying with them on their own. We try really hard to be human-centered in the way we run our business and in the culture that we try to build. And this really tested that, because we had very immediate business needs, and we had a real desire to make sure that we took care of our people.
Yeah. You're describing essentially a Wild West scenario. Yeah. With the federal government having sucked up all of your traditional sources, and then competing not just with every other state direct in China, but every other country and province around the world, all seeking to do that. And then I love this fissure you describe in the types of employee you have: those that loved the process and were somewhat lost in this, and those that embraced it. It leads me to wonder, if you were speaking to a new leadership group coming into procurement, whether in state or anywhere else, how you define the ideal procurement executive. It sounds like it would be a blend of both. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's true. I've been doing this work for a long time. In both the private sector and the public sector, I think there are lessons for the private sector in the way the public sector operates, and vice versa. So there's a lot to be said for the rigor that under normal circumstances we as public sector buyers apply to the purchasing process. The fact that statute requires us to do everything in a fair and open and competitive way actually leads, if we do it well, it leads to better outcomes than many private sector folks can achieve. But on the other hand, there's so much to be said for being able to move fast, which is why we've really tried to learn a lot from our colleagues out in Washington State and Nebraska, and a handful of other states who've really invested in lean. Because we've been really focused, and in fact, if I really feel like if we hadn't spent the prior 5 years really investing in making things like daily huddles and visual management and the lean practices that we tried to instill in our procurement teams, if we hadn't done that before the pandemic hit, we would have been much worse off than we were when the pandemic hit, because I think we were much better able to sort of run through a a plan, do, check, act cycle, a PDCA cycle. I'm geeking out on you now, Scott. But we were able to learn on the fly much more quickly because we knew how. And I think that if the pandemic had hit in year one, I would have had a lot more employees in the, oh my God, what do I do now camp, than I ultimately had in the oh cool, the chains are off, let's get going camp, right?
I love what you're saying here, because what you're saying is it's less about what you learned about a pandemic. It's more that you reap the benefits from having invested in the first place in that flexibility, lean processes, and it sounds like some degree of sort of crisis management training, essentially, that led to your organization not freezing and being able to learn rapidly. You're learning to learn rather than learning what might have been a specific issue.
Yeah, I really do think that a lot of lean practices lent themselves really well to success once when things got really hard. I also think that we had extraordinary leaders, in charge of the procurement operation. Ken Hess, my deputy secretary for procurement, is a guy who's got a ton of private sector supply chain experience, and he was in his element from the get-go. And so I give him a ton of credit for helping things move quickly. I think the other real key part of our lean investment, again, was this human-centered culture. One of the things that I give the governor tons of credit for is that we found ways to keep everybody working and to keep everybody employed. That was a really important thing to be able to do for the overall culture for our workforce as we were working through some really, really difficult challenges. And those challenges extended beyond the how do I find PPE and procurement and supply chain. They were, we manage a real estate portfolio where every lessor had to figure out how to handle our Commonwealth workforce and our Commonwealth and customers still coming to our offices, and how to handle that and make it safe. We were installing plexiglass all over the Commonwealth, in owned and leased spaces all over the place, right? We had a public works team that had to shut down every construction site in $1 billion construction portfolio, like instantly when the thing hit, and then retool, rework a bunch of terms and conditions to ensure that we had COVID safety protocols at every construction site, and then reopen every construction site, all in the course of about 6 weeks.
So you're never going to look at plexiglass ever the same again every time you see.
No, clearly not. And all these things are still going on, but I think it was really important to keep everybody on the team employed, and to keep everybody on the team focused on new challenges. We had staff who normally would work in the governor's residence, who normally would do things like, host events at the governor's residence. There's a kitchen staff there. There's a, we were able to move them out of the governor's residence where they weren't needed and put them packing boxes in the RSS, and pushing out masks and needed equipment to places all over the Commonwealth. So there was a lot of, let's find things that are productive, that are going to help us respond to the crisis. Let's use the workforce that we have, and let's keep everybody engaged and employed and as safe and healthy as we can keep them.
But that lesson for a crisis going forward is reallocate people from a resource perspective, but also for their own sense of belonging and mental health that they're needed and demanded.
Absolutely, because the alternative would have been reductions in force, that wouldn't have helped the Pennsylvania economy. It wouldn't have helped us from a productivity standpoint. And so, I give the Office of Administration here in Pennsylvania and the governor a ton of credit for figuring that out. and for helping us discover ways to work in and around our collective bargaining agreements and our typical HR bureaucracy in order to make those things happen.
The rapid movement from preparing hors d'oeuvres for their garden party to packing boxes of PPE.
That literally happened in Pennsylvania.
I want to go back to, so I think the competition between the states and with the federal government around PPE in particular came to national attention when I believe it was Governor Hogan sent the Maryland National Guard to protect the shipment that was arriving into Baltimore Airport. I presume it was Baltimore. I think that's when many of us went, oh, this is getting interesting. Where did you, well, two questions. One is, how was the pressure from the governor's office at that point? I don't mean the governor in particular, but the governor's office. But also, was there any attempt to collaborate? Was there any incentive to collaborate with other states around procurement?
Yeah, there actually, a little bit later, I don't remember exactly when Governor Hogan took that dramatic step. Happily, we didn't do anything quite like that, or didn't have to. As I recall, maybe 2-3 months into the crisis, Governor Wolf joined a consortium conversation with the governors of New Jersey and New York, and I believe Governor Hogan in Maryland, and the northeastern states, I believe, started a conversation together about sharing resources. I don't know that it had too dramatic effect at an operational level, because I think that at the end of the day, our orders were pretty clear: get what you need. And I'm sure that it was the same for every other procurement team in every other state. So I don't think we ever overcame the dynamic where we were competing with each other for the same materials. And I think the only way to overcome that dynamic is to either have a stockpile on hand or to have a reliable national stockpile. There's no other way to avoid that, it seems to me.
Yeah, the laws of economics called laws for reasons.
Yeah. I mean, our contract price for an N95 mask before the pandemic was about 75 cents. And I think at the height of it, probably, in March or April of last year, we were probably spending $7 or $8.
Hey, Curt, I can get you an N95, and I'm really good friends with Governor Wolf. Isn't that the call you were receiving? Yeah.
I got that call a lot. And I'll bet a lot of my colleagues around the country got that call as well.
Who knew?
Probably from the same guy.
I got so many friends. Yeah. So very briefly, what role do you feel the federal supply chain has in managing crises going forward, both in your mind and the mind of your peers across the country in procurement?
Oh, I think, Scott, this is one of those things that I think we have to figure out. Clearly, it didn't work this time. So I hope that we'll have an opportunity to participate in the dialogue that's necessary in order for us to be able to frame up, what should we have at a federal level? What sort of capacity should we maintain, at a state level? I'm aware that I think something like 37 or 38 other states are engaged in the same effort that I'm in to establish a state stockpile. And that makes perfect sense to me, because I don't think we should leave anything to chance. But I'd love to be involved in a dialogue with other states and with the feds about what this really should look like going forward. Clearly, it didn't work this time.
Yeah. I was thinking back to what you're talking about keeping the life of inventory in rotations, and it sounds like there's potential to spread that risk across multiple states, whether it's through bilateral cooperation or at a federal level.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're one of the largest states, right? So like we might have, I think we have sufficient demand under normal times for that inventory to be able to make that model work for Pennsylvania. But if you just look at the variance, I mean, I'm looking at a $5 to $6 million incremental annual investment in order to maintain that stockpile going forward. And I'm willing to bet that our anticipated program might be 10 times the size of some smaller states. And I think, for smaller states, more of a consortium might make a lot more sense. But a lot of this challenge is, part of the challenge, it seems to me, is geographic. We right now we're very focused on, okay, where do we locate this warehouse? I want it within close proximity to the decision makers in Harrisburg. I want it centrally located in the state. I want to be able to get the materials to where they're most needed within the state, within a matter of hours if I can. And so that has real implications. It means I'm not going to put the warehouse in Philadelphia, and I'm not going to put it in Pittsburgh either. And so I can imagine that, we have we have states out west, right, that are very vast geographically, but have relatively few people. I think it's a whole different challenge for them than it is for us.
Interesting. Maybe that's a breakout session at a future event. Where does one put the warehouse in the States? Last couple of questions. You touched on sort of rapid acquisition, and I presume you found yourself bringing in new vendors to the state supply system that very rapidly. One is, are you going to keep those vendors around? Did you create positive experiences and relationships through that? And the second is, how does this affect the diversity of procurement in terms of women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses? Did it generate any opportunities, or was actually a wind against the movement towards a more diverse vendor base?
Those are two really great questions. So for the first, yes, I imagine we'll keep some of those vendors around. I think in particular, one of the things we did working with our Department of Community and Economic Development was set up a portal for Pennsylvania suppliers who wanted to get into the business of manufacturing some or providing some of the things that we really needed. And for a handful of suppliers who came to us through that portal, they've had really positive experiences with the Commonwealth. We've had really positive experiences with them. And I think we're going to find ways to keep them on board. I think one of the ways we handled the need to move really quickly, honestly, was to circumvent a lot of the old processes, right? So we raised a P card limit from $10,000 to $100,000 in many instances, so that we could get things delivered without having to go through the process of vendor registration and those kinds of things, those things that tend to make us and our suppliers sticky with each other, right?
Sticky is a very polite way of describing that. Sticky. Yeah.
Well, yeah. It's a technical term. And then on the DISBO front, we call it diversity, inclusion, and small business opportunities in Pennsylvania. It's been a mixed bag. Again, we had the benefit of the work that we did before the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, we had grown SDB participation in Pennsylvania from about 4% to just over 10%. And it was an outcome we were really proud of. We conducted the Commonwealth's first disparity study, and it was a big goal of the governors to really make improvements there. Then the pandemic hit, and I say it was a mixed bag because on the one hand, we had this army of agency liaisons. We had folks who were really engaged in the DISBO effort and who were at the decision-making level in each of the agencies. So DISBO effectively had a seat at the table. On the other hand, we suspended a lot of the policies and procedures that normally would compel an agency doing a procurement to consider SDB participation at the time they make a decision. So those two things sort of worked, those two things were in tension. The net of it is that our latest data suggests that our overall spending for the year was way down, but the percentage of spending with SDBs remained about constant.
So the proportion increased.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should say the proportion remained about constant.
Proportion was constant.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. So everyone experienced a reduction, but the SDBs did not experience a reduction that was greater than others.
Okay.
The one other thing I'm proud of that I would love to share with everybody is we got very engaged in an effort to try to develop a new business exclusively with a minority business task force. And that resulted in a contract to provide facilities sterilization services throughout my capital complex, and also in a handful of other areas around the state. And we effectively stood up a business using technology that was borrowed from the food service industry. I have teams sterilizing elevator buttons and surfaces all throughout the Capitol complex. And the work is being done exclusively by SDBs in Pennsylvania. And it's not small, it's about a $10 million a year kind of investment. I don't know what will become of it once we're out of the pandemic woods. But it was one way that we were able to move really quickly in order to create an opportunity during the pandemic for a handful of businesses.
You managed to keep in frame the mindset as new opportunities came up, that ensuring that opportunity is offered widely. That's great. In the last couple of minutes we have, Curt, any leadership lessons you want to share? You have, for a supply nerd, you've spoken a great deal about human-centeredness and humanity. Anything you'd like to share with your colleagues with respect to managing through crises and taking learnings from this experience?
Well, I keep coming back to that, because without it, you don't have trust. And, without trust, there's no chance of getting through these kinds of things.
Wait a second. I mean, you may just have lost your supply expert status by saying that the greatest currency in all of these transactions is trust between human beings.
Absolutely, that's true.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I trust between human beings on your team, trust to the extent that you can establish it quickly with new suppliers, in the face of a crisis. That's the heart of the matter.
So 18 months ago, we may have been taking courses about how to negotiate the last decimal percentage point on a transaction. And what we've learned through this is actually the greatest commodity is trust within a team and with the outside world.
That's my takeaway. I think, I've always been a really big fan of best value as to take it back to supply chain, right? Like, I think that's one of the things that the public sector needs to learn from the private sector, is that, you really want to make decisions as much as you can on a best value basis. And trust has to be part of your best value calculation.
Well, Curt, thank you so much for both investing your time with NASCA and trusting us to have this conversation with you. You shared an enormous amount of insights and learnings. Thank you for your work for your team over the past 18 months or so. And I hope you actually get some rest for the next few.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Strategic procurement has ranked high in NASCA's top 10 priorities for state chief administrators over the past few years. The response to the pandemic shifted this focus on procurement to stockpiles and supply chain management, a reflection of the necessity for fast response and future stockpile planning. When the podcast was recorded, NASCA members were roughly 1 year after the height of competing globally for limited critical supplies. The implications for supply chains were global in nature and were felt across a number of industries. This topic, unlike other topics on our NASCA Top 10, reflected disruption that may only remain a top priority until states determine what to do with their pandemic supplies and reevaluate their stockpile strategy. In today's episode, Secretary Topper discussed both the long-term implications for the next crisis mitigation, as well as the immediate decisions for the current warehouses and stockpile management. His first takeaway was to establish a long-range stockpile strategy. Immediately, states are recognizing the limitations of the federal government to provide supplies during a supply shock, and many are undergoing the immediate decisions of what to stockpile, how much, and for how long. Secretary Topper discussed these important discussions are currently being addressed by the Pennsylvania legislature and his team that want to balance both financial risk, unused supplies, warehouses, and increased staff capacity. Pennsylvania has decided to maintain 2 months of supplies, rotating the expired supplies. Although this decision includes a $5 million annual additional impact, as well as the construction of a new facility and specialized warehouse personnel. For states with smaller budgets or those that are geographically dispersed, a regional stockpile approach may aid in financial risk mitigation. Second, we learned have a supply chain specialist. Secretary Topper noted that in the public sector, procurement teams are tasked with the responsibility of contracting, securing, and purchasing goods. But in the private sector, supply chain specialists have things like logistical risk assessment, warehouse, transportation management, tasks that are not generally the mandate of the public sector. The long-term implications may include training your procurement staff or warehousing staff to be stockpile specialists. New skills may be needed to transform your procurement teams. Such skills may include understanding international billing, warehouse and distribution capabilities, coordinating international logistics, tariffs and taxes, and storage requirements. Third, we learned involve these new specialists in stockpile decisions. These specialists will include a framework to continuously measure risk, indicators to prepare scenarios for the controllable and foreseeable uncertainties, as well as balance labor, space, capacity, and financial risk. Secretary Topper spoke of involving these specialists early in the front end of your emergency supply process to tap into their expertise and provide guidance to agencies who may not have the supply chain expertise. And fourth, conduct supply chain risk planning as part of your emergency operations. This analysis and simulation planning will identify government agencies, partners, suppliers that are going to be potentially impacted by the emergency. This will allow your procurement team to have a variety of vendors available given a disruption. And lastly, we learned from Secretary Topper they have an agile management model. They have noted over the past 5 years, working to adopt a lean management methodology has aided in the team's ability to be nimble, scale up, and scale down. In Pennsylvania, this model of do, learn, evaluate supported a quick learning loop. Daily huddles and daily visualization aided their team. So in conclusion, Secretary Topper noted that disruptions happen. It can be almost impossible to predict the next crisis. As he noted, it's unlikely the next disaster will be a world health pandemic, and it's hard to predict and prepare fully for all of these emergencies. States must balance risk with capacity and financial implications while upskilling their staff to be supply chain specialists and operate in an agile framework. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Hope you'll check out another NASCA episode.